The person you love spoke about you to someone. Here's what was shared. My beloved child. The person you love finally spoke about you to someone, but what they shared was not the casual conversation anyone expected. Your name came up unexpectedly, and for a moment, they tried to act as though it meant nothing. But the person sitting across from them noticed something immediately. The change in their expression, the hesitation before answering, the way their voice became quieter when the conversation turned toward you. Then came a question they were not prepared for: why does this person still affect you so much? There was a long silence. They could have changed the subject. They could have pretended everything between you was finished. Instead, they admitted something they had been keeping private for much longer than anyone realized. And strangely, what they confessed was not simply that they missed you. It was something far more complicated. They explained that there are moments when you return to their mind without warning. A familiar place. A certain phrase. A quiet evening when everything slows down. Somehow, the memory of you finds its way back. But then they shared the detail that made the other person stop and listen more carefully. They said there was something about your connection they had never been able to recreate with anyone else. It wasn't perfection. It wasn't some imaginary love story without problems. It was the feeling that you understood parts of them they rarely showed anyone. And when they tried to move forward as though that connection had never mattered, something always felt unfinished. The person listening asked the obvious question: then why haven't you done anything about it? That question hit harder than expected. Don't skip, because their answer revealed exactly what has been holding them back. For the first time, the person you love admitted that silence had become easier than risking the truth. They were afraid that too much time had passed, afraid you might see them differently now, and even more afraid that approaching you could force them to face everything they should have said before. But the conversation didn't end there. The person listening challenged them with one final question: if you found out tomorrow that this person was truly moving on without you, would you still stay silent? Suddenly, there was no quick answer. Their face changed. The thought of permanently losing their chance with you seemed to make everything real in a way it hadn't before. And after several quiet seconds, they finally said something they had never admitted aloud, something that changed the entire direction of that conversation. Because what they revealed next wasn't about the past at all. It was about something they have been considering doing about you very soon. What they admitted next completely changed the mood in the room. The person you love revealed that they had been thinking about reaching out to you, not someday, not in some distant future, but much sooner than anyone knew. They had even imagined what they would say, only to stop themselves each time because one question kept haunting them. What if you no longer want to hear it? The person listening didn't let them hide behind that fear. They asked whether staying silent would hurt less than discovering the truth. That question landed deeply. Because your person suddenly realized they had been protecting themselves from rejection while quietly risking something much worse, losing you without ever giving you the chance to know what was still in their heart. But then they revealed there was another reason they had hesitated, and this reason involved something they believed about you. Apparently, they had convinced themselves that you were becoming emotionally distant. Maybe it was something they noticed, something they heard, or simply the absence of reassurance they once depended on. Whatever created that impression, they began wondering whether you had finally closed the door they kept assuming would remain slightly open. And here is where the conversation became unexpectedly emotional. They admitted that the possibility of you moving forward didn't make them angry. It made them realize how much they had taken for granted. They remembered moments when they could have been clearer. Times when they wanted to speak but chose silence. Opportunities when one honest sentence might have changed everything. The person listening finally said, "You keep talking about what you were afraid of. But what do you actually want now?" Your person didn't answer immediately. Stay till the end, because what happened after that silence revealed more than any explanation could. Instead of giving another careful answer, they finally stopped protecting themselves. They said they wanted one genuine opportunity to speak with you without interference, assumptions, or unfinished history standing between you. Not to pressure you. Not to pretend the past never happened. They simply wanted you to hear the truth directly from them before circumstances made that impossible. And then came the most revealing detail. They had apparently been waiting for a particular sign that approaching you wouldn't be completely unwelcome. The person listening challenged that idea immediately. What if you're waiting for a sign they're waiting for from you? Your person went completely quiet. That possibility had never fully occurred to them. Two people could be waiting, each interpreting the other's silence as an answer. But before the conversation ended, your person mentioned one specific thing they had recently noticed about you, and according to them, that small detail may be the reason they are finally considering breaking the silence. That small detail had been sitting in their mind for days. It wasn't a dramatic message or an obvious invitation. It was something much quieter. A subtle change in the way you seemed to be carrying yourself, as though you were no longer waiting for anyone to make up their mind. Somehow, that frightened them more than anger ever could. They told the person listening that you seemed stronger, calmer, almost ready to accept whatever direction life took next. And suddenly they understood something painful. Your silence might not mean you stopped caring. It might mean you finally stopped chasing clarity from someone who wasn't giving it. That realization shook them. Because if you were truly beginning to release the situation, then their comfortable belief that there would always be more time was disappearing. And that's when the person listening asked a question your person couldn't escape. If they walk away peacefully, what will you wish you had told them? The answer came slowly, but once it started, everything changed. Your person said they would want you to know that your importance was never measured by how often they spoke about you. In fact, they confessed that sometimes they avoided mentioning you precisely because saying your name made their feelings too visible. They admitted they had compared certain conversations, certain connections, even certain quiet moments to what they experienced with you, and something always felt different. But the most surprising confession came afterward. They said there was one misunderstanding they desperately wished they could correct because they feared you might have interpreted their distance as indifference. According to them, the truth was almost the opposite. Distance had become their way of controlling emotions they didn't know how to handle. The person listening immediately challenged them, but how could they possibly know that if you never told them? Your person had no defense. That question forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth. They had expected you to understand feelings they had never clearly expressed. They had hoped you would somehow recognize what was hidden behind hesitation, mixed signals, and silence. Now they could see how unfair that expectation had been. Something huge is waiting for you, because the conversation then shifted from feelings to action. The person listening told them that if they genuinely wanted another chance to speak, they needed to stop rehearsing imaginary conversations and decide what they would actually say if you were standing in front of them. Your person became unusually still. Then, almost as if testing the words for the first time, they began describing exactly what they wanted you to hear. But before they could finish, they stopped themselves and revealed one more secret. There was a specific moment between you that they had never forgotten, and what happened during that moment was the real reason they still believed your story might not be finished. The moment they remembered was surprisingly ordinary, which is exactly why it had stayed with them. There had been no dramatic confession, no perfect setting, no carefully chosen words. It was simply a moment when they felt completely seen by you. They had been carrying something quietly that day, trying to behave as though everything was fine, and somehow you noticed without forcing them to explain. You didn't demand answers. You didn't make the moment about yourself. You simply responded in a way that made them feel understood. While telling this story, your person admitted that they had experienced plenty of attention since then, but very little of that kind of understanding. And the person listening noticed something else. The way your person remembered tiny details about that moment that someone supposedly, over you, would have forgotten long ago. So they asked, if that memory still matters this much, why did you ever let distance grow between you? Your person struggled with that question because the answer wasn't flattering. They admitted that part of them believed there would always be another opportunity. Another conversation. Another day when everything would somehow become easier to explain. They kept postponing honesty because they thought time was protecting the connection rather than slowly changing it. But now, seeing you become less predictable to them had destroyed that illusion. They could no longer assume you would remain emotionally available while they figured themselves out. And then came another confession. They said they had recently caught themselves wanting to tell you something important before telling anyone else. Their first instinct had still been you. That realization surprised even them. Don't skip, because the person listening immediately recognized what your person was trying not to say. You weren't simply someone they remembered. In certain moments, you were still the person their heart instinctively reached toward. But the conversation became even more revealing when they were asked what they would do if they had only one opportunity left to speak honestly with you. This time, your person didn't hide behind uncertainty. They said they would begin by acknowledging the confusion they had created. They would tell you that silence should never have been used as a substitute for honesty. And most importantly, they would not ask you to forget what happened or immediately trust promises. They wanted to show you that something inside them had finally shifted. Yet just as it seemed they were ready to reveal exactly what that shift was, they hesitated again. The person listening noticed and asked what they were still afraid to admit. Your person looked away for a moment, then confessed there was something they had learned about themselves only after losing the closeness they once had with you. And what they said next explained why this conversation about you had happened now, after all this time. What they had learned about themselves was difficult to admit. They had mistaken emotional control for emotional strength. For a long time, your person believed that keeping their feelings hidden meant they were protecting themselves and keeping everything manageable. But after the closeness between you faded, they began noticing the cost of that silence. They could distract themselves, stay busy, laugh with other people, and appear completely fine, but certain thoughts still returned when everything became quiet. And during this conversation, they finally admitted that losing access to your everyday presence had taught them something being close to you never could. They hadn't fully understood your value while they still assumed you would be there. The person listening asked whether this realization was simply loneliness. Your person immediately shook their head. Because loneliness, they said, would make them miss having someone. What they were experiencing was far more specific. They were missing you. That distinction opened another door they had been avoiding. They began describing things about you that had nothing to do with romance on the surface, the way you remembered details, the way you could sense when something was wrong, the way certain conversations with you stayed in their mind long afterward. Then they confessed something unexpected. There had been occasions when they almost reached out, typed words, reconsidered them, and stopped. Not because they had nothing to say, but because everything they wanted to say felt too important for a casual message. The person listening challenged them again, "So what are you waiting for?" Your person answered with one word, courage. Not courage to contact you, exactly. Courage to accept whatever answer you might give. Because once they finally speak honestly, they won't be able to return to the comforting uncertainty where they can imagine you still feel the same. And that was when the person listening gave them a perspective they weren't prepared for. They said uncertainty might feel safer, but it was already making the decision for them. Every day your person remained silent was another day you were learning how to live without an explanation. That sentence seemed to hit them harder than anything else said during the conversation. Suddenly, they weren't thinking about rejection anymore. They were thinking about regret. They asked themselves what would hurt more, hearing that your feelings had changed, or discovering someday that you had been waiting for honesty they were too afraid to offer. For several seconds, they said nothing. Then they revealed they had already considered a specific way to approach you, something more meaningful than sending an impulsive message. But before explaining what they planned to do, your person admitted there was one truth they needed to tell you first, because without that truth, everything else they wanted to say could be misunderstood. The truth they felt you deserved to hear first was painfully simple: their distance was never meant to punish you. Your person admitted that they worried you might have interpreted their silence as a deliberate choice against you, when in reality, much of it came from their own confusion. They had feelings they couldn't organize, fears they didn't know how to explain, and questions they kept trying to answer alone. Instead of bringing those uncertainties to you, they withdrew. And with every day that passed, returning became harder because they knew they would eventually have to explain why they disappeared emotionally in the first place. The person listening asked whether they understood what that silence might have done to you. Your person lowered their voice and admitted they were beginning to understand now. That was exactly why they no longer wanted their first conversation with you to begin with excuses. They said that if they approached you, they wanted to take responsibility before asking you for anything. No dramatic promises. No pretending one conversation could repair everything. They wanted to tell you what happened inside them when the connection became serious enough to frighten them. Apparently, there had been a point when they realized you could genuinely matter to their future, and instead of moving closer, they became more cautious. That confession surprised the person listening. You pulled away because it mattered? They asked. Your person nodded. They explained that losing something casual doesn't require much courage, but risking something meaningful felt different. Suddenly there was something real to lose. And rather than trusting what was developing between you, they tried to control it. Stay with this, because what they admitted afterward revealed just how much that decision had followed them. Your person confessed that there was one conversation with you they had replayed differently countless times. They remembered what you said, what they answered, and most importantly, what they should have said but didn't. In their mind, that was one of the moments when the direction between you could have changed. And now they wanted to correct something left unfinished from that very conversation. The person listening asked what those missing words were. Your person hesitated, then quietly said they had wanted to tell you that their feelings were becoming deeper than they knew how to handle. But they swallowed those words because admitting them would have made everything real. Now, after all this time, those same words were still waiting to be spoken. Yet there was another detail they hadn't shared, the reason this confession suddenly felt urgent. Something had happened recently that made your person believe they might not have unlimited time to tell you the truth, and when they explained what it was, the person listening immediately understood why they were afraid of waiting any longer. The thing that created that urgency wasn't a dramatic event. It was a possibility your person suddenly could no longer ignore. They had heard something, perhaps indirectly, perhaps through a passing conversation, that suggested your life might be changing in a way that would make their silence permanent. They didn't know whether every detail was true, and that uncertainty made it worse. For the first time, they pictured a future where you weren't simply distant, but genuinely unavailable to the conversation they had postponed for so long. They admitted that the thought unsettled them more deeply than expected. The person listening asked, "Are you afraid of losing them, or are you afraid someone else will appreciate what you didn't?" Your person went silent. Because buried inside that question was a truth they had been avoiding. They didn't want fear or jealousy to become the reason they finally acted. If they came toward you, it needed to be because they were ready to be honest. That distinction mattered enough that they began questioning their own intentions aloud. Were they reaching for you because they genuinely wanted to rebuild something, or because the possibility of losing you had awakened their ego? Your person admitted they had asked themselves that repeatedly. And then they gave the answer that surprised the person listening. They said if you were truly happy without them, they wouldn't want to destroy that happiness simply to relieve their own regret. What they wanted was one honest opportunity for you to know what had actually been happening inside them. After that, they knew the choice had to belong to you. No pressure. No emotional games. No expectation that history guaranteed them another chance. But then the person listening asked one more question. If you expect nothing from them, why does telling them still matter so much? This time, your person answered immediately. They said it mattered because they could no longer tolerate the idea that you might carry the wrong explanation for what happened between you. They didn't want you believing you had imagined the connection, cared too deeply, or somehow weren't enough to make them stay emotionally present. The problem, they admitted, had never been that you meant too little. In some ways, you had begun to mean too much before they were prepared to handle it. And that was the sentence that changed the entire conversation. The person listening realized your person wasn't merely reminiscing anymore. They were preparing themselves to finally become accountable for what they had left unfinished. Something huge is waiting for you, because right after saying this, your person revealed that they had already made one quiet preparation for contacting you. They hadn't reached out yet. But they had written something meant specifically for you, and the first sentence of that message revealed exactly what they had been too afraid to admit all along. That first sentence was not romantic in the way anyone would expect. It didn't begin with, "I miss you," and it didn't ask whether you still thought about them. Instead, your person had written something much more vulnerable. They wanted to apologize for leaving you to interpret a silence they should have explained themselves. The person listening read the sentence and immediately understood why the message had remained unsent. Sending it would mean your person could no longer hide behind ambiguity. They would be acknowledging that what happened between you mattered, that their choices affected you, and that they remembered far more than they ever showed. But there was another line underneath it, one your person had rewritten several times. That line admitted that they still wondered what might have happened if they had been brave enough to tell you the truth when the connection between you was still close. Then the person listening noticed something strange. The message wasn't written like someone trying to win you back with perfect words. Your person had deliberately removed anything that sounded like pressure. They didn't want to tell you what you should feel. They didn't want to demand another chance. Instead, they wanted to finally give you information you should have received long ago, what they felt, why they withdrew, and why your memory continued to follow them afterward. But one sentence remained unfinished. The person listening pointed at it and asked, "What are you actually trying to say here?" Your person stared at those unfinished words for several seconds. Then they admitted the real sentence they had been afraid to write. "I don't know whether there's still a place for me in your life, but I know I never became as indifferent to you as I pretended." Saying it aloud changed something. For the first time during that entire conversation, your person wasn't talking about what they might feel someday. They were confronting what they felt now. And the person listening told them that if those words were true, they had two choices. Continue protecting themselves and live with the unanswered question, or speak honestly and respect whatever you decided afterward. Your person looked back at the unfinished message. They didn't send it immediately. Something still stopped them, not fear this time, but the realization that a message might not be enough for what needed to be said. They wanted you to hear the sincerity behind the words, not simply read them on a screen and wonder what they meant. So they began considering another way to reach you. And just before the conversation ended, your person revealed what that approach might be, but they also admitted there was one question about you they desperately wanted answered before taking that final step. The question they wanted answered was the one they had been avoiding from the beginning: would hearing from them bring you peace, or reopen something you had worked hard to close? That uncertainty mattered to your person more than they expected. They told the person listening that they didn't want to arrive suddenly in your life just because they had finally found their courage. Your feelings mattered too. Your timing mattered. So instead of planning some dramatic appearance, they began thinking about a gentler approach, one that would give you complete freedom to respond or remain silent. But the person listening noticed something important. Every time your person talked about respecting your boundaries, there was still a quiet hope underneath their words. They weren't expecting forgiveness. They weren't assuming reconciliation. Yet somewhere inside them, they were hoping you might still be willing to hear the truth. Then came the question that exposed exactly what that hope meant. If they answered you tonight, the person asked, what would you want to hear first? Your person smiled faintly, but their answer wasn't what anyone expected. They didn't say they wanted to hear that you missed them. They didn't need some sweeping declaration that everything could return to the way it was. They simply wanted to know whether you had ever wondered about them too. Whether there had been moments when you almost reached out. Whether the connection they had been carrying privately had left any unfinished feeling inside you as well. Don't skip, because immediately after admitting this, your person revealed something they had never told anyone before. There had actually been one moment when they became convinced you were about to contact them, and what they did afterward showed just how deeply they were still affected. They said they had seen something that reminded them so strongly of you that for a few seconds, they genuinely expected your name to appear on their phone. And instead of brushing the feeling aside, they waited. They checked again later. Then again. Nothing came. That small moment shouldn't have mattered, but it did. It forced them to recognize how much hope they had quietly attached to you making the first move. The person listening immediately challenged them, why should they be the one to break the silence you helped create? Your person had no answer. And that silence became the turning point. They finally understood that waiting for you to provide reassurance before they offered honesty was simply another form of hiding. So they made a decision right there: if they approached you, they would do it without demanding a sign first. But before that decision became action, they shared one final detail about what they intended to tell you, and it was the most personal truth they had revealed about you yet. The most personal truth was something your person had almost refused to admit even to themselves. They said that when they imagined important moments in their future, your presence sometimes appeared there naturally, without effort. Not as some perfect fantasy, but in ordinary scenes, the kind that reveal who someone genuinely associates with comfort, trust, and belonging. A conversation after a difficult day. Sharing unexpected good news. Sitting beside someone who doesn't require them to perform or pretend. Somehow, when their mind wandered toward those moments, it kept returning to you. That confession made the person listening ask whether your person had ever seriously imagined building a future with you. They hesitated, then admitted they had. But there was a painful contradiction hidden inside that answer. While imagining possibilities with you privately, they had behaved publicly as though the connection could simply disappear without consequence. That contradiction finally became impossible for them to defend. The person listening told them that feelings hidden forever eventually become indistinguishable from feelings that never existed. Your person didn't argue. Instead, they admitted that this was exactly what frightened them now. You could only judge their feelings by what they had actually shown you, and they knew their actions had often communicated uncertainty rather than devotion. They couldn't expect you to decode everything they had been afraid to say. So they began describing what they wanted to do differently if you gave them even one conversation. They wanted to listen before explaining. They wanted to know what their silence had looked like from your side. Most importantly, they wanted to hear the truth even if it hurt. Because this time, they didn't want another connection built on assumptions. But the person listening warned them about something they hadn't considered. What if your truth was completely different from the one they were hoping to hear? Your person became quiet again, but this silence felt different. There was no running from the question anymore. They said they would accept whatever you told them because finally hearing your truth would be better than spending another year inventing answers inside their own head. And then they made the conversation even more revealing. They admitted there was one thing they hoped you had never doubted, that the connection had been real to them, even when their behavior failed to show its depth. They couldn't change what had already happened. They could only decide whether fear would continue writing the next chapter too. The person listening looked at the unfinished message and asked one last time, "So what happens now?" Your person took the phone back, reread everything, and made a small change to the message. But it wasn't just another edited sentence. They added something at the end. Something that turned the message from an explanation into an invitation, and those final words revealed exactly what they were hoping could happen between you next. Those final words were simple, but they carried more weight than everything written before them. Your person added that if you were comfortable, they wanted one honest conversation, not to rewrite the past, but to finally stop hiding behind it. They didn't ask you to decide anything immediately. They didn't promise that every complicated feeling could be solved in a single night. They simply wanted the chance to sit with the truth together, even if that truth turned out differently from what they hoped. The person listening read the ending twice, then asked why your person had chosen those particular words. Their answer revealed another layer. They weren't trying to return to the exact relationship you once had. Too much had happened internally for that. If anything between you ever began again, they wanted it to begin differently, with clarity instead of guessing, consistency instead of silence, and enough honesty that neither of you had to wonder where you stood. But there was still something your person hadn't included in the message. The person listening noticed it because throughout the conversation, your person had spoken repeatedly about what you meant to them, yet the message itself remained unusually careful. "You're still protecting yourself," they said. Your person initially denied it, then reread the words and realized they were right. Every sentence explained their behavior, but none clearly stated the feeling underneath it. So the person listening asked them to forget the message for a moment and answer one question without rehearsing. If they were standing here right now, what would you need them to know? Your person took a long breath. Then the careful language disappeared. They admitted they still cared about you deeply, that they had tried to reduce the connection into something easier to understand, and that none of those explanations had completely erased what they felt. That confession changed the message again. Your person didn't suddenly fill it with dramatic declarations. Instead, they added one honest sentence acknowledging that their feelings hadn't disappeared simply because communication had. Then they stopped editing. For once, they allowed the words to remain imperfect because they understood that perfection had become another excuse for delay. Stay till the end, because the person listening then asked whether they were actually going to send it. Your person looked at the screen for several seconds and said they were closer than they had ever been. But something happened before they could make that final move. A new thought crossed their mind. One connected to the last real interaction they remembered having with you. There was a detail from that exchange they had interpreted one way for months, but during this conversation, they suddenly realized they might have misunderstood it completely. And if their new interpretation was right, your silence may have been saying something very different all along. The detail they suddenly remembered was the way your final meaningful exchange had ended. For months, your person had focused on what you didn't say afterward, interpreting your silence as proof that you wanted distance. But during this conversation, they remembered something they had overlooked. Before becoming quiet, you had actually left room for honesty. Maybe it was a gentle question, a thoughtful response, or simply the fact that you never closed the conversation with anger. At the time, your person was so consumed by their own fear that they interpreted your restraint as rejection. Now they wondered whether you had actually been waiting for them to say more. The possibility unsettled them. Because if that was true, then both of you may have walked away from the same moment believing the other person had chosen silence first. The person listening asked them to describe that exchange again, slowly, without adding assumptions. Your person did. And the more they repeated what had actually happened, the clearer the difference became between facts and fear. You hadn't explicitly told them to disappear. You hadn't said the connection meant nothing. Much of the ending they had been carrying existed inside conclusions they made afterward. That realization didn't guarantee you still felt anything now, and your person understood that. But it forced them to confront how easily fear had filled every blank space with the worst possible explanation. Then the person listening asked something even harder: what if they did the same thing with your silence? Your person froze. Suddenly they imagined you interpreting their hesitation exactly as they had interpreted yours, as evidence that you didn't matter enough. And that possibility hurt more than they expected. For the first time, your person began looking at the entire story from your side rather than only through their own regret. They imagined how confusing their mixed signals might have felt. How exhausting it could have been to care about someone whose feelings remained hidden behind caution. And instead of becoming defensive, they admitted that you may have protected yourself because they gave you no reason to keep waiting. That admission changed what they wanted to say to you yet again. They no longer wanted merely to explain why they disappeared, they wanted to acknowledge what their disappearance may have communicated. But then the person listening noticed something your person hadn't realized. While describing your last exchange, they had remembered one exact sentence you said almost word for word. When asked why that sentence had stayed with them for so long, your person finally explained what they believed you were really trying to tell them that day. And their interpretation revealed the one hope they still hadn't dared to speak aloud. That hope was not that you had spent all this time waiting for them. Your person knew they had no right to assume that. What they secretly hoped was much smaller, yet somehow more meaningful, that somewhere beneath everything that happened, you had understood there was something real between you two. The sentence they remembered from your last exchange had carried a softness they couldn't forget. At the time, they had been too guarded to recognize it. Now they wondered whether you had been giving them one final opening to speak honestly without forcing them to do it. The person listening asked what your person would change if they could return to that exact moment. Their answer came instantly. They would stop trying to appear unaffected. They would tell you that the connection mattered, that losing it frightened them, and that their hesitation had never meant you were unimportant. Then they admitted the hardest part: they suspected you may have walked away believing exactly the opposite. That realization made the conversation feel less like reminiscing and more like accountability. Your person began identifying moments when they could have reassured you but remained quiet, times when a simple honest answer could have prevented weeks or months of uncertainty. Yet they also understood something important: they couldn't contact you merely to erase their guilt. If they reached out, the conversation had to respect whatever life you had built since then. The person listening asked whether they were prepared to hear that you had changed. Your person said yes, although their expression revealed how difficult that possibility felt. They were finally accepting that loving someone doesn't give you ownership over the outcome. It gives you a responsibility to be truthful about your intentions and respectful of theirs. And strangely, accepting that made them less afraid. They no longer needed to control your answer. They only needed to stop hiding their own. Then your person did something they hadn't done during the entire conversation. They read their message aloud from beginning to end. Hearing the words outside their own head changed them. There were no exaggerated promises, no demand for another chance. Just an acknowledgement of the silence, an admission that their feelings had been deeper than they showed, and an invitation to talk if you wanted one too. When they finished, the person listening didn't immediately respond. After a long pause, they asked, "Is that everything?" Your person looked down at the phone and quietly said, "Almost." There was still one sentence they had deliberately left out because writing it would expose the deepest reason they wanted this conversation with you. Something huge is waiting for you, because after everything they had already confessed, this was the one truth that frightened them most. And when they finally revealed that missing sentence aloud, even the person listening wasn't prepared for what it meant. The missing sentence was the one they had been circling around from the beginning. They didn't just want closure with you, they wanted to know whether there was still something worth rebuilding. Saying that aloud frightened them because it finally gave their hope a name. Until then, your person could pretend this was only about correcting misunderstandings or taking responsibility for the past. But the person listening immediately recognized the difference. Your person wasn't preparing to speak because they wanted to close a chapter neatly. Somewhere inside them, they wanted to discover whether the chapter had actually ended at all. Still, they knew rebuilding could never mean returning to the same patterns. If you gave them another conversation, they wanted to show up differently. And when asked what differently meant, your person answered with 3 things they had failed to give before: clarity, consistency, and the courage to say what they felt before silence could distort it. The person listening then asked the question your person had feared most: and what if they tell you it's too late? For a moment, everything became quiet. Your person admitted that hearing those words would hurt, but they also understood that you were entitled to choose peace over reopening the past. That answer revealed how much their thinking had changed. Earlier, they had been focused on whether you might reject them. Now